paper banner rustled above my head as my own children applauded in my living room, celebrating a future they'd already decided without me. As I took the paper plate from my daughter with steady hands, I kept my face calm while something colder settled in my chest. While the banner swayed with every cheer, I realized my son wouldn't meet my eyes, already complicit in the decision. The same cheerful letters blurred as I understood this wasn't family concern, but control wearing the mask of love. That's when it became clear my silence, as a father had taught them, I could be managed instead of respected. Still, I stood there knowing the celebration would end soon, and my response as their father would quietly change everything. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Henry knew something was wrong the moment he pulled into the driveway. Cars lined the curb in a way they never did anymore, balloons bobbed against the mailbox, and a banner stretched awkwardly across the porch. Happy early retirement. It read, the letters too cheerful, too loud. He sat in the truck for a few seconds longer than necessary, the engine idling, his hands resting on the steering wheel like they needed permission to move. No one had mentioned a party. No one had asked him anything at all. When he stepped inside, applause broke out. Familiar faces smiled at him, neighbors, a couple of old coworkers, distant relatives he hadn't seen in years. Music played softly in the background. Someone shoved a paper plate into his hand. Someone else hugged him too tightly and said, "You deserve this, Henry." He forced a smile, nodded, thanked people. That was what he'd always done, provided, endured, smiled through confusion. But beneath the noise and laughter, a cold unease settled in his chest. This wasn't celebration. It felt staged, managed. Samantha found him near the kitchen island, radiant and energized, like she'd just closed a big deal. Eric stood beside her, hands in his pockets, eyes flicking around the room instead of meeting Henry's. Barbara hovered a few steps back, holding a dish towel she didn't need, folding and unfolding it as if it gave her something to do. "Dad," Samantha said brightly, clinking a spoon against a glass, "we wanted to do something special for you. You've worked your whole life. You've earned rest." Henry opened his mouth to respond, but she kept going, momentum carrying her forward. "So we got you a little something." Eric stepped in then, pulling a thin envelope from a gift bag. He hesitated before handing it over, like he wasn't sure this was the right moment, or the right thing at all. Henry took it slowly. The room felt quieter now, as if everyone had leaned in without realizing it. Inside wasn't a watch, or tickets, or anything that said thank you. It was a glossy brochure, smiling seniors, manicured lawns, words like care, comfort, peace of mind printed in soft blues and greens. A nursing home. For a second, Henry genuinely thought it was a mistake, some kind of joke that hadn't landed. He looked up, waiting for laughter, an explanation, anything to ground him. Samantha smiled wider. "It's really nice, Dad, top-rated, we toured it already." The words hit him harder than shouting ever could. We toured it already, without him, without asking. "I'm not sick," Henry said quietly. He could hear his own voice, steady but distant, like it belonged to someone else. "I'm not incapable." Eric shifted his weight. "It's not like that," he muttered. "It's just planning ahead." Planning his exit. Heat crawled up Henry's neck, sharp and humiliating. He felt exposed, like the years of work, the house he paid for, the family he held together after every setback. All of it had been quietly reclassified as outdated, obsolete. Barbara stepped forward, her mouth opening as if she might finally say something that mattered. But then she stopped. Her eyes dropped to the floor. The towel twisted tighter in her hands. That silence hurt more than the brochure. Henry set the paper down carefully on the counter, aligning the edges like precision might keep his emotions in check. He straightened his shoulders. He would not raise his voice. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "This is my home. I take care of myself. I've earned the right to decide what happens to my life." Samantha's expression hardened, frustration bleeding through her practiced calm. "You're being emotional. This is for your own good." Henry looked at her then, really looked, and saw not concern but certainty. Certainty that she knew better, that his years no longer counted. "I didn't ask for this," he said, "and I won't accept it." The party didn't end right away. People lingered, pretending nothing had shifted, but the air had changed. Conversations dulled. Laughter thinned. Henry felt it all closing in, the walls of his own house suddenly unfamiliar. As the guests slowly began to leave, Henry remained standing in the kitchen, staring at the brochure he hadn't thrown away, not yet. His chest ached, not with weakness but with resolve. This wasn't over. And his children were about to learn that he was not done living or deciding for himself. Henry closed the door to his study with more force than he intended. The sound echoed through the quiet house, sharp and final. This room had always been his refuge, the place where he paid bills, read the morning paper, kept decades of documents neatly filed in drawers he alone organized. The smell of old wood and paper usually calmed him. Tonight, it did the opposite. He lowered himself into the chair behind his desk, staring at the framed photographs lining the shelves. Birthdays, graduations, a family that once needed him for everything. His chest tightened as a single thought refused to let go. They see me as a burden now, not a father, not the man who kept the lights on and the doors open, just something heavy they wanted moved out of the way. Anger simmered beneath the grief, steady and controlled. Henry stood again, straightening his back, and opened the study door. Avoiding this would only make it rot. If his children had made decisions about his life, they were going to hear exactly what it cost him. Samantha and Eric were in the living room, speaking in hushed tones that stopped the moment Henry appeared. Barbara sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes already wet. "You embarrassed me," Henry said, his voice low but unshaking. "You stood in my house and told people I was finished without ever asking me a single question." Samantha crossed her arms, her jaw tightening. "That's not fair. We were trying to help." Eric glanced at her, then at Henry, then back again. He said nothing. He never did. "Help," Henry repeated. "By deciding I can't take care of myself. By handing me a brochure like I'm a piece of furniture you're ready to replace." Eric finally spoke, his voice tentative. "Dad, Sam just thought it made sense. You know, planning." Henry's gaze snapped to his son. "Do you think I'm incapable?" Eric hesitated. That pause told Henry everything. I didn't want to argue," Eric said quietly. Samantha stepped forward, taking control the way she always had. "You're taking this personally. This isn't about disrespect. It's for your own good. You're getting older, Dad. Things happen." Henry laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Things happen to everyone. That doesn't mean you take their life out of their hands." Barbara opened her mouth again, then closed it, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her silence landed heavier than words. Henry felt something fracture inside him, not loudly, but deep enough to matter. "Why didn't you talk to me?" he asked, the question cutting through the room. "Why didn't you ask what I wanted, or what I planned?" Samantha looked away. "Because we knew you'd react like this." That was it. The truth, finally unguarded. They hadn't avoided the conversation out of care. They'd avoided it because they'd already decided, because his voice no longer fit into their version of the future. Henry nodded slowly, absorbing the realization. His autonomy hadn't just been questioned, it had been quietly erased. Decisions made, tour taken, a path laid out without him. "I am not a child," he said, "and I will not be managed." Samantha exhaled sharply, frustration flashing across her face. "You're being stubborn." "No," Henry said, "I'm being clear." The room felt smaller. the walls pressing inward as years of unspoken control and quiet overreach finally surfaced. Eric shifted again, clearly uncomfortable but still unwilling to stand up to his sister. Henry saw then how long this had been happening, how often Samantha decided and Eric followed, how easily Barbara retreated into silence. He turned away before his composure cracked. Back in the study, Henry closed the door gently this time. His hands trembled as he rested them on the desk, the weight of betrayal settling into something heavier, colder. If his children believed they could decide his fate without him, then they had forced his hand. Henry opened a drawer and pulled out a folder he hadn't touched in years. Deeds, legal papers, documents that proved this house, this life, was still his. He didn't want to fight, but dignity wasn't something he was willing to surrender. If they pushed him again, he would be ready. Henry waited until the house was quiet before making the call. Morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds, landing across the same table where the brochure still sat, untouched. He stared at it as the phone rang, his jaw set, his mind already exhausted from a night without sleep. When Alicia answered, her voice was calm, professional, steady in a way he desperately needed. "I need to know my options," Henry said, "before my family decides them for me." Alicia listened without interruption as he explained everything. The party, the brochure, the assumptions layered into every word his children had spoken. When he finished, there was a brief pause, then the unmistakable sound of papers being shifted on her end. "Henry," she said carefully, "this is your house. You own it outright. No one can force you to leave. And if adult family members are living there without a lease, you have the legal right to ask them to vacate." The words landed heavier than he expected. He hadn't called to threaten anyone. He'd called to protect himself. Still, hearing the law confirm what his instincts already knew felt like a line being drawn. "I don't want to punish them," Henry said. "I just want to be respected." "Then you need boundaries," Alicia replied. "Clear ones, and sometimes that means putting things in writing." She explained the process Oli making sure he understood every step, notice periods, proper documentation, how to keep it clean and legal. By the time the call ended, Henry had more than information. He had leverage. He sat at his desk for a long time afterward, staring at a blank document on the screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unmoving. These weren't strangers. These were his children. The thought of serving them an eviction notice felt like failure, like he was admitting something had gone irreparably wrong. But then he remembered Samantha's certainty, the way she'd spoken over him, the way decisions had been made while he stood in the same room, invisible. Henry began to type. Each word felt deliberate, controlled, stripped of emotion. Names, address, dates, terms. It wasn't anger driving him now, it was resolve. He read the notice twice, then a third time, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. He folded the paper carefully and slid it into a folder. Later that afternoon, Ron stopped by. Ron had known Henry since their 20s, back when responsibility was lighter and pride was earned with sweat, not control. He listened as Henry explained everything, his brow furrowing deeper with every sentence. "They crossed a line," Ron said finally, "and if you don't draw one back, they'll keep moving it." Henry exhaled slowly. "I don't want to lose my family." Ron nodded. "Standing up for yourself doesn't mean you're walking away. It means you're reminding them who you are." That stuck with him. Over the next few days, Samantha kept pushing. She called with updates about availability at the facility, left voicemails about wait lists and amenities, spoke as if the decision was already in motion. Henry listened without responding, each message reinforcing the same truth. She hadn't heard a word he'd said. At night, Henry returned to the notice, adjusting details, checking dates, making sure everything was correct. He hated how official it looked, how final, but he hated more the idea of being quietly erased from his own life. By the time the next family gathering was scheduled, the folder sat ready in his desk drawer. Henry stood alone in the study holding it, his reflection faintly visible in the dark window. His hands were steady now. Whatever happened next would hurt, but surrender would hurt more. When he slid the folder back into place, he knew one thing for certain. He was done being managed. Henry chose Sunday evening for the meeting on purpose. By then, the house always carried a certain heaviness, weekend energy drained, routines about to reset. Samantha arrived first, confident as ever. Her keys already in hand like this was still her place to manage. Eric followed a few minutes later, slower, cautious, as if he sensed the ground shifting beneath him. They sat at the dining table where countless family decisions had been made over the years. Dinner plates remained untouched. Barbara lingered in the hallway, close enough to hear, far enough to avoid choosing sides. Henry didn't waste time. "I asked you both here because we need to be clear about something," he said, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His voice was steady, too steady to be ignored. Samantha leaned back, arms crossed. "If this is about the facility again." Henry slid the folder across the table. The sound of paper against wood cut through the room. Samantha's eyes dropped to it, irritation flashing before curiosity took over. She opened it. Read the first line, then the second. Her face hardened. "What is this?" she snapped, though she already knew. "An eviction notice," Henry said calmly. "You have 30 days. The words detonated. "You can't be serious," Samantha said, pushing back from the table. "This is exactly what I mean. You're being stubborn, emotional. This is irrational." Eric stared at the document, his jaw tightening. He didn't speak. He never did when it mattered most. Henry met Samantha's fury without flinching. "What's irrational is making plans for my life without including me." "We were trying to help you," she shot back. "You're acting like we betrayed you." "You did," Henry said, not loudly, not angrily, just honestly. The room fell silent. Even Samantha seemed momentarily stunned by the certainty in his voice. "You decided I was finished," Henry continued. "You decided I couldn't take care of myself. You decided where I should live, and you did it without a single conversation." Eric shifted in his chair, discomfort written across his face. "Dad, maybe this went too far," he murmured, though the words lacked commitment. Samantha rounded on him. "Don't start, he's overreacting." Henry turned his gaze to his son. "Do you think that?" he asked. Eric opened his mouth, closed it, looked down. That answer was enough. "I am not a burden," Henry said, his voice tightening for the first time. "And I will not be treated like a child in my own home." Samantha laughed sharply, more defensive than amused. "So you're throwing us out? That's your solution?" "No," Henry said. "This is my boundary." She shook her head, pacing now. "You're punishing us for caring, for trying to make sure you're safe." "If you cared," Henry replied, "you would have asked." Samantha stopped pacing. "You wouldn't have listened." Henry stood then, slowly, deliberately, every year of his life grounding him instead of weighing him down. "You don't get to decide that for me." Barbara finally stepped into the room, her voice barely audible. "Henry." He looked at her, pain flickering behind his eyes, but he didn't soften. "Not this time." Samantha gathered the papers in her hand, anger trembling through her fingers. "I can't believe you're doing this." "I can't believe you made me," Henry said. The meeting ended without resolution. No apologies, no understanding, just distance, thick and unresolved. Samantha left first, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Eric followed, quieter, his hesitation lingering in the empty space he left behind. Henry remained standing at the table long after they were gone, his heart pounding, his chest tight, but his spine straight. For the first time since the party, he didn't feel small. Whatever came next, he had reclaimed something that mattered. And his children now knew he was serious. The house felt different after they left. Not quieter, emptier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to either mend or shatter completely. Henry moved through the room slowly, noticing details he'd ignored for years. The scuff near the hallway baseboard, the faded photograph still hanging crooked by the stairs. Evidence of a life lived together, now fractured. Betrayal sat heavy in his chest, not the explosive kind, but the dull, persistent ache of realizing the people you trusted most had already moved on without you. And yet, beneath that ache, there was something else. A steadiness. A sense that, for the first time in a long while, he had chosen himself. He called Alicia the next morning. She listened carefully as Henry described the meeting, Samantha's reaction, Eric's silence. When he finished, she didn't rush to fill the space. "You did what you had to do," she said finally. "Now the key is consistency. If you waver, they'll push harder." Henry nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "What happens next?" "We wait," Alicia replied. "If they contest it, we respond. If they comply, the boundary holds. Either way, you stay calm and documented." Calm, documentation. It all sounded so clinical compared to the mess churning inside him. But Henry understood something now. This wasn't just legal. It was emotional ground he was reclaiming inch by inch. Eric stopped coming by. When Henry did hear from him, it was brief texts, neutral and non-committal. "Hope you're okay, just checking in." No opinions, no loyalty declared. Eric was caught in the middle, and instead of choosing a side, he'd chosen distance. It hurt, but Henry wasn't surprised. Avoidance had always been his son's language. Samantha, on the other hand, was loud in her pain. She called Barbara constantly, her words sharp with frustration and disbelief. "He's punishing us," she said. "He's choosing pride over family." Barbara listened from the kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear, saying little. What could she say? That she understood both sides, that she'd watched her husband be diminished one assumption at a time. Silence became her shield, but it satisfied no one. Henry spent his evenings alone in the study, the same room where he'd once balanced family finances and planned futures that now felt uncertain. He thought about his children as toddlers, gripping his fingers, trusting him to lead. Somewhere along the way, leadership had turned into control in their eyes. Somewhere along the way, his strength had been mistaken for fragility. The realization hurt more than the confrontation ever had. Still, he didn't regret what he'd done. Instead of reacting, Henry stepped back. He declined invitations. He avoided explanations. He focused on small routines, morning walks, organized shelves, meals eaten without distraction. It wasn't retreat, it was regrouping. Samantha called him repeatedly. At first, he let it ring out of anger, then out of caution, eventually out of clarity. He wasn't ready to hear justifications or accusations dressed up as concern. Answering now would only reopen wounds that hadn't begun to close. On the fourth call, he turned the phone face down on the desk and left the room. The distance was painful but necessary, for them, for him. As night settled over the house, Henry stood by the window, looking out at the darkened street. He didn't know how this would end, whether it would lead to reconciliation or permanent fracture. What he did know was this: he would not give in. And the silence between him and his children was only the beginning. The silence stretched longer than Henry expected. Days passed without raised voices. Our slammed doors, but the absence of sound carried its own weight. Henry kept busy, filling his time with small, deliberate tasks, though his thoughts often drifted back to what had been said, and what hadn't. Late one afternoon, as he stood in the backyard trimming a hedge he'd neglected for years, his phone rang. Samantha's name lit up the screen. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. "Dad," she said, her voice quieter than he remembered. I'm sorry." The words landed softly, almost cautiously, as if she was afraid they might shatter if spoken too firmly. Henry closed his eyes, letting the hedge trimmer fall silent. I shouldn't have done it the way I did, Samantha continued. I shouldn't have decided things for you. I thought I was helping, but I see now how much I hurt you. Henry didn't respond right away. Anger still lingered, coiled and ready, but beneath it was exhaustion. He wanted to believe her. He needed to hear more than regret wrapped in relief. I'm willing to talk, he said finally, in person. They met 2 days later at a quiet cafe not far from the house. Samantha arrived early, already seated, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. When Henry walked in, she stood instinctively, like a child unsure of the rules again. I was wrong, she said once they sat down. No defenses this time. No explanations layered with logic, just admission. I made you feel small, like you didn't matter. Henry listened, his face unreadable. He let her speak until the words ran out, until her certainty gave way to something closer to humility. I hear you, he said when she finished. But words don't undo decisions. Trust doesn't come back just because someone apologizes. She nodded, swallowing hard. I know, I need you to know I see it now. They talked for nearly an hour, voices low, careful. Henry didn't soften his stance. He told her plainly that his independence was not negotiable. That concern without respect was just control wearing a better face. If we move forward, he said, it has to be on different terms. I understand, Samantha replied, and for the first time Henry believed she might. That evening Eric called. His apology was less polished, more halting. I should have said something, he admitted. I didn't, and I'm sorry. Henry closed his eyes, absorbing the words. Silence is still a choice, he said gently. I know, Eric replied. I'm trying to do better. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet, but it was a start. As night settled in, Henry sat alone in the living room, the weight in his chest easing just enough to breathe. The wounds were still there, raw and uncertain, but the shouting had stopped. The lines had been drawn, and for the first time acknowledged. The door to reconciliation wasn't open wide. But it wasn't closed anymore either. Henry spent the afternoon preparing the meal himself. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about reclaiming something that had always mattered to him, hosting his family under his roof on his terms. The smell of roasted chicken and herbs filled the house, familiar and grounding. Still, his chest stayed tight as he set the table, placing plates carefully, evenly spaced, as if balance could be arranged that easily. They arrived just after 6. Samantha stepped in first, cautious but composed. Eric followed, offering a small nod that carried more humility than his earlier silence ever had. Barbara lingered behind them, her eyes moving between faces, searching for signs of conflict before they even sat down. Conversation was polite at first. Weather, work, small, safe topics that avoided the sharp edges still waiting beneath the surface. Silverware clinked against plates. Glasses were lifted and set down. Everyone was trying, and it showed. Halfway through the meal, Henry set his fork down. I didn't invite you here to pretend everything's fine, he said, his voice steady but firm. I invited you because I need you to understand something. Samantha stiffened, but she didn't interrupt. Eric leaned forward slightly, attention sharpened. When you made those decisions without me, Henry continued, you didn't just hurt my feelings. You took something from me, my sense of control, my dignity. The words hung in the air, heavy but honest. I've spent my life standing up for this family, he said. I won't apologize for standing up for myself now. Samantha nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on her plate. I didn't see it that way before, she admitted. I thought I was being responsible, but I was wrong. Eric followed, quieter but sincere. I should have spoken up. I should have backed you. Barbara watched in silence, her expression unreadable, hands folded in her lap. For the first time, Henry didn't resent her quiet. This wasn't her moment to speak. It was theirs to listen. I'm not asking for permission to live my life, Henry said. I'm asking for respect. They nodded again. No arguments this time, no justifications, just listening. The rest of the dinner passed more easily. Laughter surfaced once or twice, tentative but real. Stories were shared, careful ones but genuine. It wasn't reconciliation. Not yet. But it was something closer than they'd been in weeks. When the plates were cleared and the table wiped clean, Henry felt a cautious sense of relief settle in his chest. This hadn't fixed everything, but it had opened the door. Change didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly in the form of effort. Eric started stopping by in the mornings, unannounced but welcome. Sometimes it was to help with something small, a loose cabinet hinge, a stubborn lawnmower, but more often he stayed just to talk. He asked questions Henry hadn't heard in years, about finances, about decisions, about how things had been handled before Samantha took charge of everything. Henry noticed the difference immediately. Eric wasn't deferring anymore, he was engaging. Samantha's shift was subtler but no less real. She stopped pushing, stopped offering solutions before questions were asked. When she visited, she listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, her tone carried restraint instead of certainty. Henry could tell it wasn't easy for her. Control had always been her armor. Letting go of it meant trusting something she couldn't manage. Slowly, Henry felt the tension in his chest loosen, not disappear, but ease. For the first time since the party, he allowed himself to feel something close to optimism, careful, measured, earned. It was Samantha who suggested therapy. "I don't want us to keep circling this," she said. "I want us to understand each other." Henry agreed, though part of him bristled at the idea of explaining his life to a stranger. Still, if it meant clarity, it was worth the discomfort. The therapist's office was neutral, quiet, designed to keep emotions from spilling too wildly. They sat in a loose circle, each of them holding something unspoken. At first, the conversation stayed safe, surface-level reflections, polite acknowledgments of fault. Then Eric broke. "I've always felt like I was behind," he said, his voice tight. Like no matter what I did, Samantha had already decided the way forward. It was easier to follow than to fail. The admission shifted the room. Henry turned to his son, seeing him not as passive or distant, but afraid. Afraid of making the wrong choice. Afraid of not measuring up. "You don't need to be perfect," Henry said. "You just need to choose." Eric nodded, swallowing hard. The session ended without resolution, but with honesty, and that felt like progress. They walked out together, quieter but closer, each carrying something new. Henry knew the road ahead would still test them. Old habits don't dissolve overnight. But for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a decision being made without him. It felt like a conversation. Henry hadn't planned on changing the way the business ran. For years, it had been his alone. Decisions made early in the morning, paperwork finished late at night, problems solved quietly before anyone else needed to know they existed. Letting others in felt risky. But after everything that had happened, he understood something new. Control without trust was just another kind of loneliness. So he started small. He invited Samantha to sit in on a meeting with the accountant. He asked Eric to review vendor contracts, not as an errand but as a responsibility. There were no speeches, no grand gestures, just inclusion. Samantha surprised him first. Instead of pushing her own ideas, she asked questions, listened, took notes. When she did speak, it was measured, grounded in respect for how things had always been done. Henry watched her closely, waiting for the old certainty to surface, but it didn't. What he saw instead was effort. Eric followed in his own way. He showed up early, stayed late, asked for feedback without defensiveness. He didn't always get it right, but he didn't retreat either. For Henry, that mattered more than perfection. Slowly, something shifted. The business felt lighter, not easier, but shared. When problems arose, they talked them through together. When decisions were made, they were made with conversation, not assumption. Henry felt a quiet pride settle in his chest, the kind that doesn't demand recognition. Then Tyler stepped forward. Henry hadn't expected much from his grandson, not yet, but Tyler came in with energy, ideas shaped by a different generation. He suggested small operational changes, smarter scheduling, modest investments in marketing that Henry would have dismissed years ago. This time, he listened. And it worked. Orders improved, efficiency increased, nothing flashy, just steady progress, the kind that lasts. For the first time in a long while, Henry didn't feel like he was carrying everything alone. The business wasn't just surviving, it was evolving. More importantly, so were they. There were disagreements, of course. Old instincts flared. Samantha still had moments where control tempted her. Eric still hesitated when pressure rose, but they caught themselves, adjusted, learned. The business became something more than income. It became proof. Proof that trust could be rebuilt. That family didn't have to be a battlefield. That working together didn't mean giving something up. It meant creating something stronger. One evening, as Henry locked up for the night, he looked back at the office lights still on. His children and grandson were inside, talking, planning, engaged. Not because they had to be, because they wanted to be. The realization hit him quietly but deeply. By letting go just enough, he hadn't lost his role. He'd secured his legacy. Henry didn't notice the change at first. It wasn't marked by a single conversation or decision. It revealed itself in quieter ways, in how his children spoke during meetings, in how they paused to ask instead of assuming, in how responsibility no longer felt like something he carried alone. Somewhere along the way, he stopped bracing himself. He began to see them differently. Samantha wasn't trying to control the future anymore. She was shaping it alongside him. Eric wasn't hiding behind hesitation. He was learning to trust his own judgment. And Tyler, once impulsive and uncertain, had become steady in a way that surprised them all. They worked together not as hierarchy but as a unit. Mistakes were addressed openly. Strengths were recognized without ego. When disagreements surfaced, and they still did, they were handled with conversation instead of silence. The family started something new, weekly check-ins. No agenda, no authority, just space. Sometimes it happened around the kitchen table, sometimes on a walk, sometimes over coffee. They talked about what was working and what wasn't, about stress and expectations, about how each of them needed support that week. At first, it felt awkward. Then it felt necessary. Henry listened more than he spoke. He realized he didn't need to manage everything to matter. His role wasn't to shield them from every misstep. It was to guide when asked, to offer perspective earned through experience, and to trust them carry the rest. That understanding brought unexpected peace. Tyler especially stepped into this new rhythm with quiet confidence. He offered help without waiting for direction. He backed others up without needing credit. Henry watched him closely, recognizing something familiar in the way he moved through responsibility, not rushed, not hesitant, but grounded. The younger generation was ready. That didn't make Henry obsolete. It made him proud. Challenges still came. A missed deadline, a tough client, old habits threatening to resurface. But instead of conflict, there was collaboration. Instead of resentment, accountability. They were learning, not just how to work together, but how to be a family again. One evening, after everyone had gone home, Henry remained at the table, the house quiet around him. He thought about legacy, not as something written in documents or buildings, but in behavior. In respect passed down, not demanded. For the first time since the party, his chest felt light. The future wasn't something being taken from him. It was something being built together. Time changed the tone of things. Not quickly and not cleanly, but steadily. As weeks passed and Henry spent more time with his children outside of conflict, the sharp edges began to dull. Conversations stretched longer. Silences felt less loaded. Somewhere between shared meals and late evenings reviewing paperwork, Henry started to see what had been buried beneath their mistakes. Fear. Not of inconvenience, not of responsibility, but of losing him. The realization came one quiet afternoon when they were all sitting in the living room, the television off, the windows open. No agenda, no tension waiting to erupt, just presence. "I need to say something," Henry began, his voice calm but deliberate. "I know now that you weren't trying to erase me." Samantha looked up, surprised. Eric shifted closer, attentive. "But what you did still crossed a line," Henry continued. "Concern doesn't give anyone the right to take control of someone else's life." Samantha nodded slowly, really listening this time. "I didn't understand how much staying active mattered to you," she admitted. "I thought slowing down meant safety. I didn't see that it meant losing yourself." Henry met her gaze. "Work keeps me sharp. Independence keeps me alive. Taking that away doesn't protect me, it ends me." Eric exhaled, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been holding something in for years. "I was scared," he said quietly. "Every time I looked at you, I saw time catching up. I didn't know how to love you without trying to manage the outcome." The honesty shifted the room. Henry reached over, resting a hand on his son's arm. "You don't need to take over to care," he said. "Just stay present." Tyler had been listening from the doorway, quiet as usual. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something new: accountability. "I messed up too," he said. "I treated things like jokes, like none of this was real. I didn't think about how my behavior affected you." Henry studied his grandson, seeing growth that couldn't be rushed or demanded, only earned. "I see you trying now," Henry said. "That matters." They talked for hours, about boundaries, about respect, about how helping someone meant asking, not assuming. They didn't rewrite the past, but they clarified the future. By the time the evening settled in, something had shifted again, not dramatically but meaningfully. They agreed on terms, clear ones. Henry's independence would be respected. Decisions about his life would include him. Support would be offered, not imposed. And Henry, in return, would stay open, present, involved, not disappearing behind pride. It wasn't a compromise. It was alignment. As the house quieted, Henry stood alone for a moment, absorbing the stillness. The wounds weren't gone. Trust still needed time. But for the first time, the understanding felt mutual. And that made all the difference. Because now, whatever came next would be faced together. Henry first heard about the video from Eric. "There's something you need to see," he said over the phone, his tone careful, almost cautious. Henry felt a familiar tightening in his chest at the word video. He hadn't forgotten the moment months earlier, his fall in the driveway, the shock, the pain, and later the humiliation of discovering it had been recorded and shared like a joke. He hadn't spoken much about it since. Some wounds stayed quiet because touching them hurt too much. That evening, the family gathered in the living room. Tyler stood near the television, hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked different, less defensive, less casual. When he finally met Henry's eyes, there was no humor there, only resolve. "I made this because I owe you more than an apology in private," Tyler said. "I owe you accountability." He pressed play. The screen filled with Tyler's face, unsmiling, unfiltered. He spoke slowly, deliberately, like every word mattered. "I record Ed my grandfather when he fell," he said. "And I shared it. I treated it like entertainment instead of what it really was, a moment of vulnerability." Henry felt the room fade slightly as the memory resurfaced. The sharp crack of bone against concrete, the rush of embarrassment before pain. He steadied his breathing, eyes fixed on the screen. "I betrayed his trust," Tyler continued. "I didn't think about his dignity. I didn't think about how it would make him feel, and I'm ashamed of that." Samantha's hand covered her mouth. Eric stared at the floor. Barbara sat frozen, tears gathering silently. Tyler went on, acknowledging the damage, not just to Henry but to the family. He didn't deflect, didn't explain, he owned it fully. "I hurt the man who's always shown up for me," he said. "And I can't undo that, but I can promise to do better." The video ended. The room stayed silent. Henry felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Not anger, not grief, but pride. Not because of the apology itself, but because Tyler had chosen to face his mistake publicly without being asked. That kind of growth couldn't be forced. Tyler turned off the television and faced him. "I know trust doesn't come back overnight," he said. "I'm asking for the chance to earn it." Henry took his time before responding. He looked at his grandson, the same boy he'd once taught to ride a bike, now standing there with humility instead of bravado. "I forgive you," Henry said quietly, "but forgiveness doesn't erase impact. Trust takes time." Tyler nodded, accepting the boundary without resistance. "I understand." The tension in the room eased, replaced by something warmer: recognition. This wasn't just an apology, it was a turning point. They sat together afterward talking, not about the fall, but about responsibility, about respect, about how quickly moments can be misused when empathy is missing. Tyler listened more than he spoke. As the evening wound down, Henry felt the weight of the past lighten just slightly. Healing wasn't finished, not even close. But something essential had shifted. This family wasn't just repairing damage anymore. They were learning how not to repeat it. The idea of a family vacation had come up carefully, almost tentatively. No one wanted to rush the healing, but they all understood the need for space, space away from familiar rooms that still carried echoes of conflict. A change of scenery, Henry thought, might give them room to breathe. So they packed their bags and left town together, unsure of what they'd find once they arrived. The first day was stiff. Conversation stayed polite, surface level. Laughter came late, if at all. Old habits hovered just beneath the calm, waiting for an opening. Henry watched his children closely, measuring their effort not by what they said, but by what they didn't do. No controlling suggestions, no quiet withdrawals. By the second morning, something loosened. Eric took the lead, mapping out activities with an easy enthusiasm that felt new. He planned walks, found local spots to eat, made sure no one was left behind. When plans shifted, he adjusted without tension, keeping the mood light. Samantha changed too. One afternoon, she and Henry sat on a quiet porch overlooking the water, the rest of the family inside. The moment felt unguarded in a way their conversations hadn't been before. "I didn't understand how much independence meant to you," she admitted. "I thought rest was kindness. I didn't realize it felt like erasure." Henry listened, the breeze carrying the weight of her words away before they could sting. "I don't need to stop," he said. "I need to stay me." She nodded, finally hearing it. Tyler, for his part, tried harder than anyone. He asked Henry about his past, listened, shared stories without joking them away. The effort wasn't loud, but it was consistent. By the time the trip ended, something real had formed. Not perfection, but connection. On the drive home, Henry looked out the window, thinking about how memory works, how new moments can soften old ones without replacing them. This trip wouldn't erase what had happened, but it gave them something better to hold on to. Healing, he realized, didn't arrive with certainty. It arrived with willingness. When they returned from the trip, Henry didn't let momentum fade. A few days later, he asked Samantha and Eric to come over, not for a meal, not for business, but for clarity. They sat in the living room where so many difficult conversations had begun, though this time the tension felt different, quieter, less defensive. "We've made progress," Henry said, "but progress only matters if we protect it." Samantha nodded, attentive. Eric leaned forward, hands clasped, fully present. They talked about patience first, how easily old habits could return when stress crept in. Samantha admitted that her instinct to take control still surfaced, especially when she felt responsible for outcomes. Eric acknowledged his tendency to retreat rather and risk being wrong. Naming these patterns stripped them of their power. Respect became the next subject. My independence isn't optional, Henry said. It's part of who I am. This time there was no resistance, only understanding. Henry surprised himself by admitting something he'd held back. I've been afraid, he said. Afraid that if I let go, I'd be replaced. Samantha's expression softened. You're not being replaced, she said. You're being trusted. Tyler joined the conversation later that evening. He spoke carefully, offering to take on more responsibility in the business, not as a gesture, but as a commitment. Henry saw the seriousness in his eyes and felt a deep sense of pride. I'm ready, Tyler said. Henry believed him. Gratitude came next, not the polite kind, but the earned kind. Henry thanked each of them openly for the effort they'd made. He told them he saw the changes, that they mattered. Before they parted, they agreed on something simple but powerful: regular check-ins. No assumptions, no silent resentment, just communication. As the house quieted again, Henry felt something settle inside him. This wasn't an ending. It was balance. The opportunity arrived quietly, tucked inside an email Tyler almost didn't open. He read it twice before telling anyone, the weight of it settling in his chest. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a leap, more responsibility, more visibility, more risk than anything he'd faced before. The kind of chance that exposed who you really were when pressure stripped away excuses. When Tyler finally brought it up, the room reacted in layers. Samantha's first instinct was caution. Questions came quickly, about stability, long-term impact, the cost of failure. Eric was quieter, thoughtful, asking what Tyler wanted rather than what he feared. Henry said nothing at first. He watched his grandson carefully, studying not just his words but his posture, his restraint. This was different from before. There was no rush in Tyler's voice, no impulsive certainty. He spoke slowly, weighing his thoughts, acknowledging the risks without dramatizing them. I know it won't be easy, he said, but I'm ready to work for it. Still, concern lingered. They wanted him to succeed. They also knew how easily ambition could pull someone backward into old habits, cutting corners, chasing validation, burning out fast and loud. Henry felt that tension keenly. He remembered his own early years, when pride had nearly cost him everything. You don't have to prove anything to us, Henry said finally. Tyler met his gaze. I'm not doing this to prove something, he replied. I'm doing it because I'm prepared. That answer stayed with Henry. Tyler took a few days before deciding. He didn't announce anything. He thought. He walked. He listened. He reflected on the mistakes he'd made, the trust he'd broken, the effort it had taken to rebuild both. For the first time, he wasn't chasing momentum. He was choosing direction. When he told them his decision, it was clear and calm. I'm taking it, he said, but I'm doing it my way, no shortcuts. Samantha surprised herself by letting go. She offered guidance without control. Eric backed Tyler openly, reminding him he wasn't alone. They didn't hover. They didn't intervene. They trusted. Henry felt something shift inside him. Pride, yes, but also recognition. Tyler wasn't just growing into responsibility. He was stepping into the family's values, carrying them forward without being asked. Henry saw in him the same resolve that had once carried him through lean years and hard choices. That night they celebrated, not extravagantly but meaningfully. A shared meal, real laughter, quiet pride that didn't need an audience. Tyler didn't boast. He thanked them. As the evening wound down, Henry lingered at the table, watching his family talk easily around him. The last test hadn't broken Tyler. It had revealed him. And for the first time, Henry saw the future clearly, not as something he feared losing, but something he could finally trust. Henry sat alone in the study late one evening, the house quiet in a way that no longer felt heavy. The past months replayed in his mind, not as sharp fragments of conflict, but as a slow unfolding of truth. He thought about how close he'd come to being dismissed, managed, quietly sidelined. And he thought about what had surprised him most, not the betrayal, but the willingness to change once the damage was finally seen. For most of his life, Henry had believed legacy meant stability, a house paid for, a business sustained, children who never had to struggle the way he once did. But sitting there now, pen resting against paper, he realized how incomplete that definition had been. Success without respect meant nothing. He began to write. The letter wasn't formal. It wasn't long, but every word was deliberate. He thanked Samantha and Eric for confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves, for choosing growth over pride. He acknowledged the fear that had driven their mistakes and the courage it had taken to face him afterward instead of doubling down. "I see you," he wrote, "not just as my children but as people willing to learn." When Samantha and Eric read the letter together a few days later, neither spoke at first. Samantha folded the paper carefully, holding it as if it might tear if handled roughly. Eric read it twice, slower the second time. They hadn't realized how deeply Henry had been watching them, not judging, but witnessing. For the first time, they didn't feel like they were repairing something broken. They felt like they were building something new. Tyler read the letter later that night, sitting on the edge of his bed. He hadn't expected it to hit him the way it did. The words weren't addressed to him directly, yet he felt seen all the same. He thought about the mistakes he'd made, the trust he'd taken lightly, the example he'd almost lost. He pulled out a notebook and began to write his own letter. He thanked Henry for not giving up on him, for setting boundaries instead of walking away, for showing him that accountability wasn't punishment, it was respect. "I wouldn't be who I am without you," he wrote, and for the first time he meant it without embarrassment. When the family gathered again, the atmosphere was different. There was ease now, not the fragile kind that feared disruption, but the grounded kind built on shared understanding. They talked about the future, about what they wanted the family to stand for long after individual roles shifted. Respect, independence, accountability, presence. They agreed these weren't just lessons for this moment, but values to be passed down, spoken openly, modeled clearly, protected intentionally. Henry listened, quietly proud. He understood now that his role was changing. He didn't need to be at the center of every decision. He didn't need to grip control to remain relevant. His strength wasn't fading. It was transforming into something steadier. Wisdom, perspective, example. Before the evening ended, someone suggested a family reunion, not out of obligation but celebration, a marker of where they'd been and where they were going. Plans were made, dates discussed, laughter returned without effort. As Henry looked around the room, he felt something settle deeply in his chest. This was legacy. Not the absence of conflict, but the courage to face it. And the family he'd nearly lost was now something stronger than it had ever been before. Henry found himself waking earlier than usual. The house was still dark when he sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee warming his hands. In the quiet, he replayed the months behind him, not with bitterness but with clarity. He could see now how close he'd come to mistaking pride for strength. For years, control had felt like responsibility. Letting go had felt like failure. But it had been fear. Fear of becoming irrelevant. Fear of being sidelined. Fear of losing the role that had defined him for decades. That fear had hardened into pride, and that pride had built walls where bridges should have been. Henry exhaled slowly, the realization settling gently instead of stinging. Samantha noticed the change first. "You're different," she said one afternoon as they sorted through old boxes in the garage. There was no accusation in her voice, only observation. More open. Henry smiled faintly. I'm listening more. Eric echoed it later that week during a quiet moment on the back porch. It means a lot, he said. The way you've let us in, it feels like you trust us now. Henry nodded. I do. They spent time together in ways that didn't revolve around fixing problems. Samantha reorganized the home office with efficiency and restraint. Eric worked on restoring an old workbench, taking his time, refusing to rush the process. Tyler took on extra responsibility without being asked, handling tasks that once would have overwhelmed him. Henry watched it all unfold with quiet gratitude. Evening slowed. The family gathered without agenda, sometimes around a shared project, sometimes just around conversation. Laughter returned without effort. The house felt lived in again, not managed. One night Henry and Barbara sat together on the porch, the air cool, the street quiet. For a long time neither spoke. We made it through, Barbara said softly. Henry reached for her hand. We did. They didn't need to say more. Years of shared struggle, of unspoken tension, of resilience had shaped them. And somehow this storm had strengthened what remained. Tyler continued to rise. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. He followed through. He asked for guidance when he needed it. He owned mistakes without deflection. Henry saw now that this wasn't a phase. It was a foundation being built. The weight Henry had carried for so long began to ease. He realized he didn't have to hold everything together anymore. He wasn't alone at the center of the family. He was part of it. As the night settled, Henry looked around the house, at the people who filled it with life again, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The journey hadn't been easy, it hadn't been clean, but it had been real. And for the first time, Henry knew the weight he'd carried all these years was finally shared. Letting go came easier than Henry expected. Not because the business mattered less, but because the people holding it now mattered more. He began transferring responsibility gradually, not as a retreat, but as a vote of confidence. Decisions that once lived solely on his desk were now discussed openly. Authority was shared, not seized. Samantha stepped into leadership with a different posture than before. She still moved with purpose, still saw angles others missed, but now she asked before acting. She listened. She honored the systems Henry had built instead of rewriting them out of impatience. Eric found his rhythm alongside her. Where Samantha was decisive, Eric was steady. He handled operations with care, catching details that others overlooked. He didn't avoid pressure anymore. He absorbed it, adapted, and moved forward. And Tyler brought energy. Not recklessness, vision. He suggested refinements that modernized the business without erasing its foundation. Digital outreach, smarter scheduling, strategic partnerships. Each idea came with preparation, not impulse. Henry watched with quiet admiration. The business responded. Growth wasn't explosive, but it was consistent, sustainable. Clients noticed. So did competitors. More importantly, the family noticed how well they functioned together when trust replaced control. Henry stepped back further, choosing when to advise instead of insisting on oversight. He filled his mornings with walks, reading, projects he'd postponed for years. He didn't feel displaced. He felt free. The family worked together with a new awareness of time, of boundaries, of one another. When challenges surfaced, they faced them as a unit. Disagreements were handled with respect. Victories were shared without ego. One evening, Henry stood at the edge of the office, watching them collaborate, voices calm, focused, aligned. The business no longer needed him at the center to survive. And that was the greatest proof of all. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about staying in charge. It was about knowing when to trust. As they closed up for the night, Samantha caught his eye and smiled, not in gratitude but in partnership. Eric nodded, grounded and confident. Tyler looked energized, purposeful. Henry felt a deep, steady pride settle in his chest. The business had been reborn, and so had the family behind it. The recognition came on an ordinary evening, which somehow made it mean more. Henry stood with his family in a community hall he'd visited dozens of times over the years, though never like this. Neighbors filled the room, local business owners, people who had watched him work quietly, consistently, without spectacle. When their family name was called, the applause felt steady and sincere, not loud for show. Samantha glanced at Henry as they walked forward, pride clear in her expression. Eric stayed close, grounded, no longer shrinking from attention. Tyler stood tall, no trace of the reckless boy he'd once been. Henry felt the weight of the moment settle in, not as pressure, but as confirmation. They were being recognized for their contributions, but what struck Henry most was what wasn't said aloud: how far they'd come to stand here together. Later, gathered around a small table near the back of the room, they talked quietly about how none of this would have been possible months ago, about how easily things could have gone another way. "I didn't think we'd end up here," Eric admitted. "Not like this." Henry nodded. "Neither did I." Tyler spoke next, his voice steady, confident. He shared news about his career, progress that once would have sounded like bragging but now felt grounded. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said simply. "All of you." There was no embarrassment in his gratitude, no defensiveness, just honesty. The celebration afterward was modest. Laughter over shared stories, a toast that wasn't rehearsed. They didn't dwell on the past, but they didn't ignore it either. The growth they'd earned was part of the joy. Henry watched his children move through the room, engaged, respected, present. He felt proud not just of what they'd accomplished, but of how they changed. The trust between them felt solid now, reinforced by effort instead of assumption. As the night wound down, they stepped outside together. The air was cool, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. For a moment, no one spoke. "What's next?" Samantha asked finally. Henry smiled. "Whatever we face together." They talked about the future then, about expanding the business carefully, about making time for one another, about protecting what they'd rebuilt. No grand promises, just intention. Standing there, Henry felt something settle deep in his chest. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was real. Because his family wasn't fractured or guarded anymore. Because respect had replaced control and trust had replaced fear. As they turned toward their cars, Henry looked back once more, taking in the sight of them, his family united. And he knew, without doubt, that this was everything he'd hoped it could be. The celebration wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. It took place at Henry's house, the same one that had nearly become a symbol of loss, now filled with warmth again. The table was crowded with familiar dishes, laughter rising and falling naturally. No tea forced or careful. This wasn't a performance of unity. It was the quiet confidence of having earned it. They talked about the journey openly. Not just the good parts, but the uncomfortable ones too. Samantha spoke first, her voice steady as she acknowledged how close she'd come to confusing control with care. "You didn't back down," she said to Henry, "and if you had, we wouldn't be here like this." Eric nodded. "You taught us something important," he added. "That respect isn't automatic, it's practiced." Tyler listened, then spoke with clarity that would have been impossible a year ago. "You didn't give up on us," he said, "even when we made it easy to." Henry felt the words land deep. He hadn't stood up for himself out of anger alone. He'd done it because dignity mattered, because silence would have taught the wrong lesson, not just to his children but to himself. And now, looking around the room, he saw the result of that choice. Connection. They talked about how much had changed, how conversations felt different now, less guarded, more honest, how disagreements no longer felt like threats but opportunities to listen. Old wounds weren't erased, but they no longer dictated the present. Henry didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He let them speak. When it was his turn, he chose his words carefully. "I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid that standing my ground would cost me my family. I didn't expect it to bring us closer." That truth settled into the room. He looked at his children, not as people who needed managing, but as adults shaped by experience, capable of leading with wisdom. Pride swelled in his chest, not loud or possessive, but steady. They were ready. The family wasn't perfect. It never would be, but perfection had never been the goal. Respect was, understanding was, presence was. As the evening wound down, they stood together near the doorway, the house quiet again but no longer empty. No one rushed to leave. No one avoided eye contact. There was ease in their closeness now. Henry took a breath, absorbing the moment fully. This was the legacy he'd almost lost, and ultimately reclaimed. As father and children stood side by side, they knew that the journey they'd taken together had solidified their bond forever, a legacy of love, respect, and mutual understanding.